Hello, my name is Carolyn Perry. I chose Margaret Burke White for my visual essay, and I will be going over some history of her photography, some styles, and a riff. Hopefully by the end you will have caught a glimpse of why I chose her to do my visual essay. So first off, some history about Margaret Burke White is she was born in 1904 and died in 1971 from Parkinson's disease. When she was a little girl, her father was an inventor and a photographer, and Margaret loved to tag along with her father, and she would take her own pictures on a matchbox, but she wouldn't begin to practice photography until she reached adulthood. In college, Margaret took a photography class, and her mother bought her a second-hand camera after her father died. While still in college, Margaret began to take pictures of architecture and machinery. This was probably due to her early influence with her father. And later on, she began to do some freelance photography of architecture work. In 1929, Margaret began working as a photographer for the New Fortune magazine. They sent her to photograph the Crump Iron Works in Germany. She then continued on her own from Germany to photograph the first five-year plan in the Soviet Union. In 1936, she was hired by Life magazine as one of their first of four photographers. The cover of the very first issue of Life was a picture Margaret had taken of the Fort Peck Dam. Life sent her on assignments to photograph the Dust Bowl, Germany, Russia, Africa, and World War II, and Gandhi. She was the first female allowed to photograph the U.S. Armed Forces. Near the end of the war, Margaret photographed the bodies of the victims of the Holocaust. She was an absolute fearless photographer. While sailing in Africa, her ship was torpedoed and sank, but Margaret survived and was able to photograph the wreckage. Margaret did whatever it took to get the perfect picture. I included an image of her on top of the Chrysler Building just so she could capture the perfect angle. Even after she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, she still kept with her photography. Margaret used light and shadows to add depth to many of her images. She took a humanistic approach to her photography, and many of them contained irony. Of Lester's 6 perspectives, her photography covered personal, historical, and cultural. The 2 images here are of the Washington Bridge and the American Way. As you can see in both of these images, light play is in use to add depth to the images. Margaret often built shapes and designs with her architectural photography. She was constantly finding unique angles. As you can see in the Washington Bridge, she's found an angle that's low to the ground, so that way she's capturing the magnitude and height of the bridge. She's using light play to catch on the high points, but also letting shadows come in and play and add new shapes and angles that weren't originally there in the bridge. In American Way, she used Lester's perspective of culture by photographing as a social documentarian. In Lester's book, he describes how cultural photography is really just whatever is most popular at that time. If you take a look at this image with the refugees lined up in front of this large sign with the big happy American family, that big happy American family was what was popular at the time, but Margaret Burke White added a bit of irony to it and showed the real life that America was in at that time. In this way, she also uses historical perspective. Margaret knew her photography would help preserve history. Margaret also used a personal perspective in her photography. Through this, we are able to get a small glimpse into her eyes and souls and see her humanistic approach to photography and how she always wanted to capture real life. I chose to do my riff of her architectural photography because that is what I am most fascinated with. I feel as if she preferred architectural photography over her assignment photography. My image is of the St. Francis Cathedral in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was about 3 p.m. when I took this photo, so the light was very harsh, and you have to be careful so you don't overexpose your image. I had to be very aware of where I placed the sun in this image so that way I could still have some light play, but also have some shadows casting on the building. I ultimately chose to position the sun behind the tower. So as you can see in my photo, there are a few rays of the sun sticking out, kind of casting a little bit more of a shadow onto the cathedral. I noticed that in Margaret's Washington Bridge photo that she had a very low angle, so that way she could catch the magnitude and the height of the bridge. I also prefer to find low angles whenever I'm doing buildings and architecture, just because I want to really truly catch just how tall the building is. For this particular image, I was actually laying on the ground on my back with my camera positioned straight up. So that way you could just kind of see through my eyes standing next to it, just how far I had to look up and how big I felt this building was. If I could do the picture again, I would go at a different time of day where there's more shadow play, because I feel like the cathedral just has so much architectural work and design on it that I could have definitely played more on building a shape and doing shadow play. But overall, I really enjoyed playing with the light and trying to emulate Margaret's architectural photography style. I think Margaret's work has helped shape other photographers and how they catch people with a humanistic approach, how they catch people even when they're staged, and how they can still capture the soul and the hurt or the pain or the real life in their eyes. I personally became very inspired learning more and more about Margaret because she was absolutely so fearless, and that's how I want to be with my photography. I don't want to be afraid to get out there on the Chrysler building or get out on a tall building just so I could get the angle that I want and show people what I see just for maybe a few moments, and maybe that can help change the world just like Margaret did through her photography.